Every track, and I mean every single track on this album, is pure gold in my opinion. Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. I am Molly, and in this video I am going to be ranking all 10 studio albums from the metal band Converge. Now, I've been wanting to do a Converge album ranking here on my channel ever since Converge put out their most recent album last year, Bloodmoon 1 with Chelsea Wolfe. I really got into that album. I thought it had a great sound, and it made me really want to dive further into Converge's discography and kind of just see what I think of their music and hear their progression over their 10 albums. And yeah, we'll just see which Converge album ends up being my favorite. Alright, so before I dive on into my ranking, I'm going to go through my little ranking system real fast. A+ are the albums that I think are absolute perfection. A are the albums that are extremely close to perfect. B are for the very solid albums. C are for the kind of underwhelming ones, maybe a little bit forgettable. And then D are for my personal least favorites. So I'm going to go in order of when these albums were released. That means we're starting off with Converge's debut album, Halo in a Haystack, that they put out in 1994. It's fun to listen to. It's got a ton of energy. It's very manic and crazy, which is honestly kind of what I love about it. There's just a lot of noise getting thrown at you. The track Becoming a Stranger is just so intense. I love it. And also Antithesis, the bridge toward the end is like one of the few quiet moments on this album, and it kind of makes this track stand out for me. It just lends a little bit of a breathing period almost on this album before just the manic intensity starts up again. But Halo in a Haystack, Converge's first album, I don't hate it. It's not the best in their discography, but it's also not the worst in my opinion. I think I'm going to put Halo in a Haystack in C. I'll be honest, it's almost in B for me. I low-key enjoy this one, but I think I'm going to put it in C. Up next is Converge's 1996 album called Petitioning The Empty Sky. This one sonically is pretty similar to their first. I feel like their debut album it throws a lot at you and it's a little all over the place, but it's kind of memorable for that reason because it's so chaotic. And it's almost like their second album, they polished it up just enough to make it almost more forgettable in a weird way. There's definitely some moments on this album I enjoy. On The Saddest Day, I kind of like around the halfway mark how it slows down and then they introduce those guitars. And also on Shingles, the really plucky guitars on that track are cool. But overall, I don't know, it's just kind of a meh album for me. It definitely doesn't really stand out in their discography. So for that reason, I think Petitioning the Empty Sky, I'm going to put in D. It's just not my favorite from Converge. There's not really any tracks on this one I find myself going back to, so yeah, I think it's going to fall in D for me. Alright, and up next is When Forever Comes Crashing. This one Converge released in 1998. Again, kind of like their first two, a very similar sound for sure. There is something about When Forever Comes Crashing though that it's just tighter, like they polish it up just a little bit more. Everything just sounds more put together. The vocals too are a little bit lighter on this one, a little bit less intensity and kind of all of that manic energy going on. It's still definitely a very experimental album. I would say it's a bit rough around the edges, but you can definitely start to hear where their sound evolves from this album into the rest of their discography. I think the biggest standout on this album for me is the Lowest Common Denominator. This track is actually really cool. I love it. It's got all of this industrial noise and like screeching or beeping going on. I will say I think this album is just slightly long-winded, and like I said, it definitely could use some more polishing up. It's a little rough around the edges, but it's definitely a solid album. There's moments on it I enjoy. I think it's better than their first studio album. I don't know if it's quite in B for me personally, so I think I'm going to put When Forever Comes Crashing in C, and I will put it above their debut album. Up next is Converge's 2001 album, Jane Doe. This one's amazing. It's just absolutely brilliant. I can't get enough of this album, frankly, and I can't believe the leaps and bounds Converge took going from their first three albums, which are good. They're definitely decent albums, and then they just somehow whipped Jane Doe out. It kind kind of starts out sounding similar to their first three, and then over the course of its runtime, Jane Doe just becomes something else entirely in like the best way possible. I really like on Jane Doe how the vocals are still very intense, they just bring that raw energy, but they almost tone them down a little bit more and they balance out the vocals with the instrumentals really well. On their earlier albums, I tended to find that sometimes the vocals would almost overpower the instrumentals at times, like they were just so manic and intense, and on Jane Doe they kind of balance out the sound a bit better. Fault and Fracture with the guitar solo and just how it builds up towards the end, that track is incredible. And Homewrecker, again, how this track builds is just absolutely amazing. They just bring the energy on this album. I think Thaw is my absolute favorite on this entire album. That one is such a good track. It just starts with that like wildcat sounding screech from the vocals, and then with the guitar and everything, oh man, it's just such a good track. So I'm gonna cut right to the chase. For me, Jane Doe is absolutely A+, right at the top. It delivers on the emotional vulnerability, but there's the power and intensity to it too. Just absolutely amazing. Up next is You Fail Me. This is Converge's 2004 album, and to me there's something very snappy about this one. I just like how they constructed it and put it together. It's so incredibly cohesive, and it just cuts right to the chase. It's so unrelenting with its sound, which I really love. They definitely play around a lot with dynamics on this one. There's a lot of back and forth between really quiet moments, and then they just bring the intensity at other parts, and they balance that out really well. The opening track, First Light, into the second track, Last Light, is one of my favorite parts actually on this album. I just think it's such a cool opener. It just hits right. There's so much visceral intensity to its sound. Also, the track Drop Out has some really futuristic, modern sounding guitar on it. And then the title track, You Fail Me, is probably my favorite on this whole album. It just has a really dark, kind of creepy tone to it, which I love. And then paired with the intense vocals, it just kind of amplifies that whole atmosphere that they create on this track. So overall, You Fail Me is a great album. I just think it sounds so good. It's really well put together. It is not on par with Jane Doe, but I would absolutely put You Fail Me in A. And then up next is going to be Converge's 2006 album, No Heroes. Overall, I found it to be really well crafted, but it's kind of all over the place. You could almost say it's a little bit meandering at times. It's just lacking a little bit of structure almost. They also definitely introduce a little bit more softness on No Heroes. It's not that I dislike it, it's just, like I said, this album kind of meanders. Its sound changes a little bit, and I'm not sure if it's the most cohesive in that regard. I do really like the track Grim Heart Black Rose. This one, like I said, it's kind of one of the tracks they slow down a little bit, but it still has that great dark, like heavy sludginess to it. And also the track To the Lions was a standout. This one just goes and goes and goes. It never stops. It's so unrelenting. I just absolutely love it. So overall, with No Heroes, I think it's a good album. It's just a little bit meandering with its sound. I think it could have been constructed a little bit more cohesively. So I think No Heroes I'm going to put in C, and I will put it above their debut and When Forever Comes Crashing Down. Up next is Converge's 2009 album Axe to Fall. This one has such an interesting tone to it. It's definitely a little bit of a departure from their earlier albums. There's a weird low-key country western vibe that I pick up on at moments throughout Axe to Fall, which is kind of strange. I don't know if I love it, but it's definitely interesting to listen to. A good example of that is the track Cruel Bloom. I don't know, there's just like a weird country sound that one gives off. The percussion throughout this album is absolutely wild. I love it. The vocals are weirdly lighter, but also there's kind of like a grungier, dirtier, almost drawl to the sound of them too. There's just something very unconstructed about Axe to Fall, which I can appreciate from an experimental point of view. I just don't necessarily think it's their most cohesive, but there's definitely moments on it that shine. The track Slave Driver, with just the pound pounding percussion at the start, and then when they introduce the guitars, and then the closing track on Axe to Fall, Wretched World, is brilliant. It just has this really slowly building up ominous sound to it. It just kind of delivers on this really crushing intensity without hitting you over the head with sound. But ultimately, Axe to Fall, there are some amazing moments on it. I like how they experiment and play around a lot with their sound. They're definitely changing some things up on this one. I just think it's missing on a few things here and there. It's not their most compelling album, but it's also by no means their worst at all. So I think I'm pretty content putting Axe to Fall right in the middle. I'd put it in B. Up next is All We Love We Leave Behind. This is Converge's 2012 album. This one, again, they kind of go in a different direction with their sound, like just slightly. There's a little bit less of that really heavy, dirty, sludgy sound, and there's kind of a lighter tone to this album, a little bit almost more playful at times. So much going on and yet so incredibly cohesive. I kept listening to this album expecting for there to be a moment where I was like slightly underwhelmed, and it never came. Every track, and I mean every single track on this album, is pure gold in my opinion. Some standouts though, I would say Trespasses. There's kind of a grooviness to this track that I really love. Also, Coral Blue was a standout. It's a little bit more of a melodic, reined-in track, but when the sound hits toward the end, it's like something just crashes into the ocean, and it just brings this wave of intensity, which is absolutely amazing. Also, the instrumental track Precipice is a huge standout on this album. It kind of has an industrial tone to it, and at the very beginning, it's very, very reminiscent to me of Feral Love by Chelsea Wolfe, and my favorite track on this album is the title track, All We Love We Leave Behind. How it starts with that percussion at the beginning, and then when they introduce the guitar, it just is mind-blowing. It's so good. So needless to say, All We Love We Leave Behind for me is an absolute A+. I still prefer Jane Doe. Jane Doe is absolutely incredible, but All We Love We Leave Behind is a solid second place winner for me. Up next is going to be Converge's 2017 album, The Dusk In Us. This one kind of is a similar sound to All We Love We Leave Behind, but they infuse just a touch more melodicness and restraint on it. It just has some really, really beautiful moments paired with such ferocity. The track A Single Tear, I just really enjoy how this one builds up, and the vocals, it almost sounds like he's crying out for something in a way. I Can Tell You About Pain really embraces more of that industrial sound with all the squeaky, metallic sound effects going on. And also the title track, The Dusk In Us, is a little more restrained. They kind of bring that melodic touch to this one. It's not on par with Jane Doe or All We Love We Leave Behind for me personally, but I think it's a really, really well crafted, constructed album that just sounds amazing. So I think The Dusk In Us, I'm going to put in A, and it's honestly right on par with You Fail Me. I might put it slightly ahead of You Fail Me, but I think they're about tied. And last up is Bloodmoon 1. This is Converge's most recent album that came out last year in 2021, and it's a collaboration album that they worked on with Chelsea Wolfe, who lends some of the vocals to this album as well. For me, what stands out about this one is the atmosphere. The tone of this album from start to end is absolutely fantastic. It just sounds so dark and haunting and witchy. It's definitely a slow burn kind of album. It kind of takes a little time to get into, but once you've really sat and started listening to it, it's weirdly addictive. You just have to listen to the whole thing. On previous Converge albums, the runtimes of a lot of their tracks are shorter, and they just are very snappy with their delivery, like they just bring the intensity. And Bloodmoon 1, you definitely kind of have to sit with it, sit in the sound a little bit. The tracks take more time to build up and really develop their sound. I think my favorite track on this whole album is Bloodmoon, the opening one. It just has such an amazing haunting atmosphere, and I like the balance of vocals between the more intense raw ones, but then Chelsea Wolfe kind of brings a slightly more calm melodic side to her vocals, and it's just a really great balance between the two. Also, Tongues Playing Dead is just a fun one. It brings a slightly more groovy edge to this album, which makes it stand out. So overall, Bloodmoon 1, I think it's just a really well thought out, crafted album. It sounds so good. I think for me, I just have to be in the mood for it. That's really the only issue, if you can call it an issue, that I have with this album, just because it's such a slow burn. But when I am in the mood for it, it hits perfect. It's just an amazing album. So I think Bloodmoon 1, I'm very happy putting in A, and I think I'll put it at the bottom of A, below You Fail Me and The Dusk In Us. So there it is. That is my final Converge album ranking. In A+, the perfect albums for me, we have Jane Doe, and we have All We Love We Leave Behind. In A, so the nearly perfect albums, we have The Dusk In Us, You Fail Me, and Bloodmoon 1. In B, so the solid albums, we have Axe to Fall. In C, so kind of the slightly meh, forgettable albums, we have No Heroes, When Forever Comes Crashing, and Halo in a Haystack. And then in D, which are my personal least favorites, we just have Petitioning the Empty Sky. So there you have it. That is my final Converge album ranking. I loved making this video and going through and really giving their entire discography a thorough listening to, because they're an amazing band. I can't stress enough how good each and every one of these albums are. Even my least favorite is an absolutely killer album, in my opinion. They haven't put out a bad album yet. And obviously this list is totally subjective. This is just my opinion. Definitely let me know in the comments if you agree or disagree with my ranking. And yeah, as usual, thank you all so much for watching. Stay tuned, and I will see you in the next video.